We're going to spend the next little bit here talking about pre-verbal and nonverbal memories. And I think this is really a very rich part of what we're going to be speaking about here, because especially when we're working with complex PTSD, we are often working with experiences that happen in the first 3-5 years of life, sometimes 10 years of life, and the piece about distinguishing both pre-verbal and nonverbal memories is that pre-verbal memories are that which is usually 0 to 3, 0 to 5, before the hippocampus has fully come online to help us form declarative memory. Nonverbal memories are for those clients who say, well, I don't remember anything from before I was 12. Right? I have no memory from before I was 10, and that's pretty common. And or the nonverbal components of memories. I remember parts of the experience, but then I have this gap where I remember nothing, but I just have this feeling in my body. And so that's how we're using the distinction between the terms. So again, our earliest pre-verbal memories are not verbal. They're not stored. They're not stored in words, right? They're stored as images and motor patterns and sensations. Motor patterns, the urge to contract. Pre-verbal memory can be stored in a posture, can be stored in a gesture. They are often stored in blueprints of our earliest relationships, and they're represented by psychophysiological arousal and emotions. So a related term here is implicit versus explicit memory. And some of this might be familiar for you. The implicit memory system is dominant from birth to age 3, provides the foundation for a felt sense of self, and again is stored as these motor patterns and sensations. Explicit memory is our memory for facts, time, place, provides a basis for our verbal narrative, and helps us develop a coherent sense of self over time. An important piece about situational memory, or about implicit memory, is that it's situational. It's situationally accessible in the way that state-dependent memories exist, right? So that if you're familiar with that term, state-dependent memory, that's something that is a memory that is formed in a certain emotional or physiological arousal state within a certain place with certain environmental cues. We're more likely to recall that memory when those cues are activated again in our environment, right? Or in our internal environment. When we feel sad, we're more likely to remember other times that we were sad. Yeah? When we feel angry, other memories of times that we were angry kind of piggyback on that and say, me too, come forward, right? And our implicit memories are sustained through repeated patterns. So we actually, through kind of habit, continue to repeat what we know and what we've learned that support that felt sense of self. So a certain posture that is formed as a result of an ongoing experience in childhood then kind of reinforces a sense of self over time. I'll give another example. This is a man that I was working with, and every time we started to kind of get, he would come in, he was well presented when he would show up, he was kind of in that today self, right? And then we would start to get closer to talking about his childhood abuse, and there would be a certain point in which he would state shift, right? Not full DID, but he would go into a state shift, and it was marked by a repeated motion in which he would do this. Now, at first, when I brought his attention to that rapid turning his head to the side, it was too disturbing, and he had no words for it. Over time, we were able to stay with that motion, and he was able to identify that it was him flinching, trying to get away from his dad's hand in his memory of being hit. And that this implicit memory actually was held by this repeated motion. that was actually what we had to work with. He had other explicit memories of being hit, but that physiological response was kind of holding the marker or the access point to getting into the felt experience. So implicit memories are held through habit, as Aristotle would say, we are what we repeatedly do. And that we ultimately, in order to work with explicit memory patterns, we need to break the cycle. We need to stop the repeating pattern and find a new experience. And we'll talk about that as we go. So, once again, our preverbal memories is distinct from our nonverbal memories. The preverbals are those which exist typically before age 3, when the amygdala is primary, and the nonverbal memories are the way that traumatic stress impairs our memory structures involved with explicit memory, in which case the later memories are stored as these fragments or sensory and body experiences. I think I'll add here, just looking at some of my notes, that that part of what happens here is that because the adrenaline or the cortisols activate the amygdala, that this can lead to our sensory components of memories to be vividly recalled, right? So that there can be a way in which the look on mom's face, the gestures that she made, again, the smell in the house, that those can be very vividly imprinted in the memory system. I worked with one gal, I had spoken about her earlier, the one with the 5 aces and the boarding school, but her mother had smoked, and the smell of smoke on a person in an environment would consistently evoke a very primal disgust response in her, because the experience of the no exit in her household and the smoke in the household really facilitated this that feeling of being trapped, and that would repeat as part of the memory triggered by that sensory experience. Another reason why it's so hard to verbalize about experiences is that Broca's area, the part of the cortex that's associated with verbal processing, is also impacted by traumatic stress, which makes it hard to verbalize about the experience immediately after, and of course sometimes years later. So with events going on in our current world where women are coming forward, not just women, men too, but people are coming forward and sharing experiences of their memory and being challenged, well, how come you don't remember how you got home? Right? Because, how come you don't remember parts of the memory? Because that's how traumatic memory works, that there are parts of the memory that become not accessible. It doesn't, yes.
During the deposition for Kavanaugh, the woman who was being, she's a psychologist, and she went through the memory pathway.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. So for those of you watching from home, talking a little bit about the relevance of this for Christine Ford and Kavanaugh. So in times of extreme stress or trauma, high arousal states disrupt hippocampal functioning, leading to hyperamnesia or enhanced memory for affect and sensations, but amnesia or loss of memory for facts. And I think that's a really important key piece to hold. Well, how come you can remember parts of this or not others? Not that anyone in this room would ask that question, right? Okay, we are all trauma informed in here. Okay, so here's that other related question. Are implicit memories accurate? Well, not necessarily, right? So implicit memories do not represent an exact replay of the original set of events. This is in part because when we are retrieving a memory, we have just this felt sense or a gist or a little snippet, a little image, a feeling, a sensory experience, and then we as human beings love narrative. We love story, so we want to fill in the missing pieces of those memories. And what we fill in those gaps can sometimes be influenced by our current environment. by our current experience, right? So memory retrieval is highly malleable and very prone to getting reconstructed, which of course has its benefits for us as trauma therapists, because we can actually work with the way that we can reconsolidate memory, and we can work with building in kind of positive repair elements to what was once a really awful experience. It doesn't mean that we can actually change what happened. We're not magicians. Right? But we can change how someone reflects upon what happened with new information, with new meaning making, with a new experience now of finally having support that maybe wasn't available then. Right? And I think that fundamental need for narrative is a very powerful part of why meaning making is a really essential part of trauma recovery. And it's not for us to know the meaning that the client is ultimately going to make about their experience. We don't get to play God, right? That is their job, is really to ultimately come to their own conclusions. But we get to be guides and helpful containers for that process and witness to that process. And ultimately, when someone comes through trauma recovery and out the other side and feels stronger as a result, it's a tremendous gift of the role that we get to play. Right? So, did I skip a slide? I'm just going back. Yes. Okay, so disruptions to memory consolidation and retrieval can lead to a disorganized sense of self and fragmented sense of self. Possible dissociation as the coherent narrative of self is compromised. Right? And there's a lot in that statement. I want to speak more about dissociation so that we can better understand really what this is saying. So we'll go into this here. So as I mentioned earlier, we can think of dissociation as a biological survival mechanism that disconnects the individual from threatening experiences. Right? Patterns of dissociation that once saved a child can become a hindrance to the adult, who might continue to dissociate as a learned coping mechanism. Right? And as a result, what happens is that the adult starts to feel cut off or disconnected from their emotions or their body or their sensations or other people. And that split feels awful, right? Sometimes it's referred to as that kind of going through the motions, or you're kind of just performing, you're acting as if. But underneath all of the feelings of authenticity and of being real or being connected to yourself, they're being pushed down because you don't really want anyone to find out that you're just faking it. And again, in that range or that continuum of dissociative experience, just right there, that feeling of who I really am, I have to keep under wraps, that's exhausting. So we can think of dissociation as a disorder of perception. I use this image, this optical illusion here, because it really represents the ways in which we can get stuck in a certain way of seeing things, and how hard it can be to shift our perception, our mindset, into seeing something differently, right? So you can look at this and you might see the young woman, or you might see the old hag, and recognize how challenging it is to shift between the two, right? In a way, it's very representational of what it's like to live with dissociation and with a trauma response, is that I'm either stuck in the past, looking behind me, that's all I can see, or I'm in some way or another kind of cut off from that, and I'm going through this motion, but I feel like I've got all these kind of layers holding me down, right? I can go with that metaphor for a while. But ultimately, what we're seeing is the challenge in holding the experience that happened. It happened to me. It's over now, right? I'm here and now. I'm not in the past. my body is actually part of me. My emotions, my thoughts, my feelings, right? I'm owning that. That the me of then is part of the me now. Right? Not either or. And ultimately that my actions in the present belong to me. So the loss of flexibility of the self, that inability to hold multiple perspectives at the same time, is a big part of what we call non-realization or derealization, one of those components of dissociation. The folks from the structural dissociation model out of Vanderhart and Ninehouse and Kathy Steele, they use non-realization versus derealization. They're rather interchangeable, but it's ultimately the inability to realize that that happened and it happened to me and it's over. Right? So that blending of past and present occurs. And our phobias also maintain dissociation. What I mean here is that it's the phobia of the memory itself. It's the phobia of the parts of self that carry aspects of the traumatic memory or carry shame. It's the phobia of being attached, having a healthy relationship now, falling in love, experiencing loss, right? It's the phobia of inner experiences, arousal states, affect, body sensations, and that our work here is to build greater tolerance for all of those states so that they can be turned toward, addressed, no longer avoided, but also that when we turn toward them that they don't take over. Right? That it's not that either or state of I don't have that memory, or when I have the memory it's all I know. Yes, please.
You're not saying that all phobias are the maintenance of dissociation, are you?
I am not, although I think that we can really look at the role that the role that trauma plays in the development of many phobias. Right? And how often when we look more deeply into agoraphobia or into, actually, I find this when I'm working with individuals with fear of heights, when I'm working with people with fear of flying, that actually when we go down into the root of what is familiar about that feeling, there's often a trauma derivative underneath, which is rather fascinating. Yeah. So, we'll speak here a little bit more about shame and learned helplessness. We were talking about that persistent childhood trauma is characterized by learned helplessness and also shame. And I think that this is such an important piece, that when there is no way to stop the abuse, to stop daddy from drinking, to stop daddy from hurting mommy, right? All of those experiences, a child feels powerless. Right? And when a child witnesses something bad, they feel bad. And that creates this confusion about who's at fault. Right? There is this internalization, I'm a bad kid. They weren't bad. No? And it's a distorted sense of self as a failure or being damaged or unworthy. And adults who were abused as children often continue to blame themselves for the abuse. Do you guys see this? Yeah, lots of ahas in the room. Yeah. There's another piece that I want to add here about shame, and this was a relatively recent piece that I came across, and again, it was after I made my slides, so my apologies that it's not in here written down for you. But this is the work of a man named Sylvan Tompkins. Anyone familiar with his work? He and another, and then there was an analyst, Donald Nathanson, that took the work of Sylvan Tompkins and wrote more about it. And their work is on shame as well. And what struck me about it is Sylvan Tompkins was an affect, or I don't think he's living anymore, an affect neurobiologist, and he spent much of his career trying to understand shame. And what he identified is that shame is very closely related to what he called the thwarting of positive emotions. All right? So that it's not just that something bad happened out there and I internalized it. It's that something bad happened out there and I tried to do something to make it better and it didn't work. I tried to reach for you and you rejected me. That it has to do with that I'm bringing myself, my joy, my excitement, my gift, my compassion, my empathy to the world, and you don't want to receive it. And that it has to do with that, that experience of rejection, that experience of being kind of displaced or put down, that is very closely connected here. And that shame shows up as an emotion, but it also shows up in the body, right? So that the way in which, if you think about that reach or that positive expansion of self, and then when that's rejected, what happens on the other side? A contraction. You know, so that the hiding of one's face, the blushing, the experience of contracting in the posture are all very central parts of the emotion of shame. And that sometimes when we're looking at the ongoing experience in a family where maybe there wasn't overt abuse or neglect, but there was the chronic experience of not being understood, right? That there is this kind of accumulation of the small and subtle rejections of the authentic self. And I think that, again, just as kind of wise relational clinicians, we want to look at that and also look at where maybe in subtle ways there's recapitulations of that might happen in relationship if we're moving too quickly and we're missing a moment to really stop and meet a person just where they are. One last piece that I'll name about the work of Donald Nathanson and Sylvan Tompkins is that they describe that shame has an evolutionary purpose. Right? They say that this emotion holds the remnants of our unextinguished longing. I will. It really touched me, and it's why I wanted to share it with you. Shame has an evolutionary purpose. It holds the remnants of our unextinguished longings. And that when we're working with shame and that drawing in, with that shutting down, that inability to make eye contact, that we can also hold that underneath that is the deep desire to connect and to be seen. So this next piece comes from a man named Jim Knipe. He's one of the most influential people in my thinking. He was my supervisor for about 10 years, and I'll just put a little plug in here for supervision. I still seek supervision. I go for individual twice a month and group consultation once a month. It is so incredibly valuable, and because our work is so complex and there is so much that we're processing, and to be able to kind of have another set of eyes on me and on what is often such a private part of the work and help me see what I might be missing, so incredibly valuable, and let alone for self-care and to be held inside of this work. So just a plug for that piece of the self-care and the whole process. So Jim Knipe, who is my consultant and supervisor for a long time, he wrote a book called The EMDR Toolbox for Working with Complex PTSD with EMDR. And his understanding of shame is that this kind of self-blame is a direct link to childhood logic, to that fantasy or idealization thinking. That children develop a fantasy that they are bad kids relying on good parents to avoid confronting the terrifying reality that they are good kids relying on bad parents. Yeah. And I think that that's something that we see often in our offices, is that my childhood was fine, no problem there, and you're hearing it going, well, I don't think it was so fine. Right? Or, gosh, that sounds like that might have been really scary. But to sit with how that defense structure helped them survive. You know? And that it comes out of the fact that that's all that they knew. They didn't have a different set of parents, most of them. So, looking more deeply with dissociation, this again comes from structural dissociation theory and this sense of a divided self. So what they call that part that's going through the motion or acting as if is the apparently normal part, the ANP. And I have to tell you, it's a funny language, apparently normal part, but when I have described that to, I don't just use that language with all of my clients, but for the few that I do, they get it. They go, oh my gosh, you know what it's like to be me, right? That apparently normal thing that I do, that I'm going out there and I'm just pretending, and I just feel like I'm going through the motions, and there's something so deeply like compassion building about being understood and what that feels like. And that within this model, there's also the emotional part, the part that's holding the emotions and the memories connected to the trauma. Right? Anyone in here use structural dissociation already? Anyone in here use IFS? Great. You can see some of the parallels, right? So that there is the exile inside of the emotional part. Yeah. And I'll just name here that for me, working with parts is an essential part of working with complex PTSD in whatever part of that continuum someone lives on with dissociative symptoms, whether it's anything from just feeling kind of tired and foggy sometimes, or feeling a little disconnected from the body, to more extreme forms of dissociation symptoms. And that there's also defensive parts. These defensive parts basically keep the exiled or the emotional parts, the parts that we don't want to feel or acknowledge, out of consciousness. And do so by pushing that down underground in some way or another. I don't have to feel it if I pretend that doesn't exist. And defensive parts can show up through addictions. Defensive parts can show up through denial, through lots of other, again, through idealization. They were fine, I'm just bad. There's lots of other, kind of structures that push those traumatic memories and experiences underground. And dissociation occurs when a traumatic event cannot be fully realized, non-realization, right, or accommodated by the client. The affect or arousal associated with a traumatic event can't be tolerated, and the client might experience both hyperarousal and hypoarousal symptoms. So let's take a closer look at that one through the window of tolerance. So window of tolerance was originally developed by Dan Siegel, and this is giving attention to the physiological arousal that is associated with trauma recovery. And what we see here, and this is a very simple version of it, and you can see more complex versions that are out there, but basically that each individual has their own kind of capacity or window of what amount of sensation, arousal state, emotion, physical experience in the body that they can stay present with, that they know how to respond to effectively, that they can basically effectively regulate, right? And that that through traumatic experiences, that we can get taken out of the window at the top of that arousal continuum, where we get taken into hyperarousal states, which are sympathetic nervous system, anxiety, panic attacks are a great example here. That vigilance, that maintained state up here that is dysregulated or outside of that ability to, it interferes with our ability to be here and present and effective. And then we have our hypoarousal states, right? Here is where you begin to feel shut down or numb or disconnected, fatigued. I remember a client who just suddenly, and I have to say, like, it's after lunch, I'm going to lose you all to hypoarousal about 2 o'clock, so we've got 18 minutes to get okay. But do you ever feel that? And sometimes it's a very induced state, and I'm not just talking about your 2 o'clock client, but Do you ever feel like there are certain clients that you have a harder time staying awake with? Yeah, nods in the room. It's like this induction. My co-teacher, Barb Mayberger, and I, she and I are also co-authors together, she and I will talk about the dorsal vagal vortex. And the next thing you know, you're just getting sucked in to the vortex with the client, and you're feeling fatigued or foggy, or you start to not be able to think clearly. And so it, again, speaks to why we need to keep ourselves regulated to do this work. The biggest piece here is that when we can help clients learn their own unique to them cues of when they're coming up to the top or bottom of their window of tolerance, we can help them develop the skills to stay more regulated. So if they're starting, this is, you were talking about the man who just, goes out 0 to 100, right? And we want to slow that down, and it's not always possible depending on whatever the injury is, but we want to slow that down and help them be able to use neuroception and also interoceptive awareness to say, okay, I'm noticing that my heart rate is increasing. I'm noticing that I'm starting to hold my breath. Those are my signals that I need to ground. Those are my signals that I need to put the brakes on the trauma processing and slow down. And initially, co-regulation, I'm tracking the client. I'm noticing my body. And if it's moving too fast for me to process with them, for me to stay regulated, then usually it's a sign that they're moving too fast. It's usually not the other way around. Eventually, the goal is to widen the window of tolerance. And we want to help clients be able to hold more, to tolerate more, to build more of that distress tolerance, to feel more capable. Going back to phobias, I had a gal that I was working with who had experienced a suicide in her life, and she happened to be the first one on the scene and had seen more than she could tolerate, more than she could handle. And her life got so contracted that by about 2 years after the event, she was barely leaving her house. And that phobia of experience had gotten so strong that she literally was becoming agoraphobic. She was in her early 30s. So, she had a lot of life ahead of her, but was so terrified of that had already been too much. She didn't want to possibly see something else that could be overwhelming. All right? And so initially, we were helping her build a capacity to stay within a window of tolerance so that she could actually regulate herself within what she was already exposing herself to. And then the challenge was, to broaden that window, to be able to tolerate more. How long are you going to go out of your house today? What are you going to do to take care of yourself while you're out there? Where are you going to go? What time are you going to go? Who's going to be with you? All of those building of that, but ultimately being able to recognize that she had to broaden that out. And in some ways that's a metaphor that ultimately we want to be able to broaden that window of tolerance to tolerate more. There's Peter Levine, the developer of somatic experiencing, uses another lovely metaphor here, and you can imagine this with our image here, that at the top of that window where that top curve is an eddy in a river, right? And that if the water is flowing downstream and a traumatic event happens, it creates this little eddy. And that all of a sudden our stream of consciousness, our own thoughts and emotions and sense of self gets stuck in that eddy. And we keep recycling around and around, and we cannot seem to just get moving through that. We keep getting stuck there, recycling the images, the thoughts, the what I should have done, the what I didn't do, right? And that what he says so wisely is, we can't get rid of what happened. We're not going to be able to make that eddy or that erosion of the bank go away. What we can do is if we widen the river, if we widen the capacity of the self to include that eroded aspect of the bank, then nothing gets stuck in there anymore. So we ultimately need to grow the capacity of the self to accommodate what happened in our meaning making, in our somatic experience, and to then be able to pass through it. It still might be objectively upsetting material, but we don't get stuck recycling it. Is that a helpful metaphor? Do you get where I'm going with that? Okay. So again, a little recap here. Window of tolerance. It's an optimal zone of the nervous system arousal where clients can respond effectively to their emotions and sensations. That's Dan Siegel's work. If we're above, we feel anxious, overwhelmed, panicked, and below, shut down, numb, or disconnected. And some of the hyperarousal symptoms and hypoarousal symptoms: irritability, anxiety, restlessness, crying uncontrollably, rage, etc., versus fatigue, lethargy, helplessness, fawning. That's something that we haven't spoken about so much, but I think it's important to mention here as we speak about complex PTSD. Is fawning is referred to as a kind of obedience behavior that again helps one survive. So one of you was speaking earlier about what happens when abuse is ongoing and then you kind of participate in the abuse, right? This happens a lot with sexual abuse survivors as children who then actually themselves are going and seeking out their abuser, or they're taking care of their abuser, right? And there's a way in which it's driven by obedience, it's driven by the care system that takes over in the affect circuits, the emotion circuits, and it's very, very confusing when adults come in and they're looking back at that behavior. What was wrong with me that I didn't stop the abuse, and in fact I was continuing it in my own way. I was going and seeking it out, and the way that the child then is taking care of their abuser, who might have been a parent or a relative, right? And so it's a very confusing setup in which one part of the individual is going out and seeking proximity because that's what we do to survive. And another part is feeling confused or disgusted or hurt, and this split happens between those two parts of self. So looking at these very complex types of symptoms and behaviors and how that can perpetuate into adulthood, for example, going out and continuing to seek out relational partners who are abusers, right? When we are working within the window of tolerance, it is common for individuals with complex PTSD to feel stuck in hyperarousal, hypoarousal, or to alternate between the two extremes. Our well-paced therapeutic interventions help the client work through traumatic memories without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down in the process. And I think that is just the key factor here, is what is well-paced for that individual. Because there are some people that come in and they say, I'm ready, I have lived with this for so long in my life, and I really just want to get through this. And sometimes they think, I'm ready and just bring it on and I can handle anything, and you start to go in there and it's like, whoa, wait a second. You think you're ready, but hang on, you don't have enough resources to go in there yet. You're overwhelming yourself, and here's what I'm observing. And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes they really are ready. And so we're always fine-tuning that dance and really speaking about how much are we pushing the gas pedal in trauma processing, and how much are we putting the brakes on and backing up and really getting ready and doing more preparation or resourcing. Yes, please.
I don't know, I think it's common, but when you're working with a client who has complex trauma, it's almost like they become so, I don't want to say they need it in their lives, but they kind of get stuck in that routine. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes in my work, I've seen people that will put themselves in harm's way or in chaotic situations, and it's hard for them to kind of get past that. And then the question is, what's going to happen when I get better, when I get well? Mm-hmm. It's almost like a fear of getting well, mm-hmm. getting better.
Yes, yes, yes. So, and you're speaking to something so important. I'm going to reiterate it for the people that couldn't hear watching via webcast, that the question is for clients who, in a way, have lived inside of their trauma symptoms for so long that it becomes a part of the identity, that to let go of the symptoms themselves really is an existential crisis. Yeah, it becomes a confrontation at which this is all that I know, this is how I know to get my needs met, this is who I know myself to be in the world, I don't know how to live another way. And sometimes this gets perpetuated by what we can refer to as secondary gains, in which the symptoms actually are helping me get my needs met, and I'm not ready to let go of my symptoms because I don't know any other way to get the relational needs met or emotional needs met or dependency needs met. And so we have to very delicately, non-judgmentally understand the complexity of those secondary gains and motivators. Thank you. Yes.
I just want to get your view on something. I'm going to be starting as a new clinician in a hospital, and I've been a psychiatric nurse for those of my inpatients. But as a clinician, when you're seeing people in therapy, obviously you're working through these traumas. But if you're seeing someone that's only going to be in the hospital, maybe it was precipitated by a suicide attempt, and you're consulting for them or something, and they do have complex PTSD. What threshold don't you want to cross? Because they're going to be discharging in 5 days and you open up Pandora's box.
Yeah, you don't want to open Pandora's box. Good.
What's some thoughts on that?
Good. Really, really valuable question. Again, I'm going to repeat it. So if you have short-term work, you're working in inpatient hospital, and someone comes in and you've got them for maybe 5 days, maybe a 72-hour, right? And how to not open Pandora's box. So really the purpose of that kind of short-term hospitalization is stabilization, right? And as you are creating a sense of safety now, doing some stabilization, doing some resourcing around the person, but you're having enough conversation, or you look over their clinical notes and you go, wow, this person has complex PTSD, this person has experienced trauma for, since they were 2 years old, and they've had multiple suicide attempts and so forth. I think at that point, the best that we can do is to provide compassion, to really hold a sense of it's possible to recover from this, and you're going to need ongoing support, and to get their buy-in. To go on and to do some longer work. And all of that said, I had this one gal that came in to see me post-hospitalization, and we were kind of going over, she had attempted suicide, she ended up in the hospital and was there for a 72-hour hold. She had her 3 days, and I said, what was that like for you? And she said, honestly, there was one person in there that was amazing. I said, what was amazing about him? And she said, well, he had me talk to this empty chair. and she talked about the power of doing this deeper work in the hospitalization, where she got to know that there was part of her that was suicidal, and that part of her was a very young part, and that there was part of her that wanted to live, and she was able to achieve just a little bit of differentiation between the part of her that wanted to live and this compassion for a part of her that wanted to die. And so that was her buy-in at that moment. They didn't do any trauma processing. But what they did do was identify that there was part of her that was holding that trauma, and that in a way was the motivating part that wanted to take her own life. And I just thought that was such a touching story that I think, again, depending on the nature of what you get to do with clients in that brief period of time, but to know that your care, that your attention, that your empathy, that your attunement makes a difference, can be the first time that someone has a sense of hope, that you're not distancing and just focusing on a diagnosis, that it's not solely about medication management for stabilization, but really seeing the person underneath the diagnosis. That's a profound impact, and And I think that for those of you that are quote unquote on that kind of front line and helping people develop a sense of faith in humanity, it's powerful. So thank you. Yeah. Let's see, where are we here? All right, so talk about accelerating and decelerating interventions. We're going to use a little bit of brain terminology as we speak about interventions here. So our top-down interventions are those which engage the upper brain centers to provide a regulation for the lower brain centers. And in a way, these kind of, whether you're using mindfulness or whether you're using some understanding of what are the core beliefs in self, some cognitive strategies, or some regulation-based DBT strategies, that ultimately our top-down interventions can help slow the brakes on processing. Because what happens for a lot of individuals that I see in my practice that come in who are chronically overwhelmed, and I think this speaks to your question that you asked about those clients who are constantly living inside of the trauma symptoms, is that they actually don't know what it feels like to not be in crisis or inside of the symptom. And to know that they actually are allowed to not process trauma all of the time, that they can be at choice as to when they're doing their trauma work and when they're not, is a really important skill. And that you can open that up and consciously choose to be doing your trauma work, and that you can put that away and have times where you're either distracting yourself, a wonderful gift from Marsha Linehan, that, you know, she's the first one that I think really identified that like distraction can be a therapeutic technique. That's cool, right? Or containment, we use that in EMDR, or being able to develop resources such as safe place imagery and so forth, to be able to put the trauma material away for periods of time to reestablish a sense of stabilization helps us put the brakes on trauma processing. And vice versa, we have our bottom-up interventions which engage some of the limbic brain centers to help client access the emotional and sensory components of a traumatic memory. And this is more like pressing the gas on the trauma processing. So here we might be looking at the specific memories, the worst parts of those memories, how it feels in your body when you think about it, what emotions arise as you think about it, how is this showing up in your life now with what symptoms and so forth. And so when we're working on accessing the components of the trauma, we're pressing the gas pedal. So we'll look more closely at what are some of these interventions. Our top-down interventions are psychoeducation and mindfulness, our cognitive interventions, resourcing interventions, talking about traumatic events, and conscious breathing, right? Being able to access that calming, regulating breath. Our bottom-up interventions, focusing on affect and emotions while processing, focusing on body sensations, following movement impulses along the lines of Peter Levine's somatic experiencing or Pat Ogden's and Kakuni Minton's sensory motor psychotherapy, inviting movement to facilitate somatic release, pendulation, which is an oscillation between a resource state and traumatic activation, and conscious breathing. It's not a mistake that it's on there twice, because the breath can both help us access the somatic components of a memory, and it can also help us regulate it. And it really depends on how we're using the breath. So, that said, we're going to move our way into a practice together. I've got one more slide before we go there. Just to name, what are the signs of a regulated nervous system? Feeling calm and alert, expressing a range of emotions without feeling stuck in feelings or in numbness. Right? I have this one gal that comes in, and part of her symptomology is that she chronically cries. And it's very hard for her. It's like this crying that doesn't ever feel like it's got an end point, and it really never satisfies. right? And so to be aware that sometimes feeling has a resolution, and to help her make that distinction between the kind of crying that feels like a healing release versus the kind of crying that reinforces that it's never going to be better. So the ability to think clearly and logically, ability to reflect on choices and make healthy decisions, feeling quote-unquote grounded, and we'll talk more about grounding exercises, awareness of body and breath, having a healthy sleep cycle. That can be really, really hard to achieve with our clients with complex PTSD. And if you, and I've certainly had moments of periods of time of insomnia in my life, if you have ever experienced that, it is so debilitating, right? And boy, it gives a lot of compassion for how hard it can be to heal from complex PTSD if on top of it you're not sleeping at night. It's so disorienting. And of course, regulation shows up in the ability to communicate clearly to others. So let's do a little mind-body break here with conscious breathing. And we're going to start with the upregulating breath because I have a feeling that we're tired. What did I say? It's 2 o'clock. Have you hit the dorsal vagal? All right. So our first practice here for upregulating, and you can do this wherever you're watching if it works for you. And if you don't want to do any of these practices, this is your day. This is your self-care. But we're going to start by rubbing the palms together, getting a little bit more warmth in your hands, a little bit more alertness. And then we're going to place the hands over the upper chest. I'll have to be a little careful of my microphone here. And for this one, we're going to inhale a little bit more rapidly. So just inhale through the nose and exhale. Good. 2 more. Good. That's probably enough. Go ahead and release your hands. You might want to shake out your arms a little bit. I see a few of you doing that. So, just 3 breaths. What do you notice? It feels great. Maybe not for everyone, right? You can feel a little tingly. Yeah. And, again, really listening with your client to what feels appropriate for them. One of those breaths might feel great, right? Or some clients, you do 3 and they're like, I feel nothing. So, there's nothing wrong either way, right? Because that's the most important thing about any of these experiments is there's no right or wrong answer, right? And when we set it up that way, that this is simply an opportunity for self-knowledge, self-study, and that we invite clients to participate in any of these little experiential moments in therapy, or whether you're in the hospital or wherever you might be, with an invitation that they know that they can say, no thanks, not for me. I don't want to do that, Dr. Schwartz. You got it. That's totally fine. You don't have to. Because, one part of good trauma therapy is that your client can say no to you. Then you're like, yeah, I've done my job. Right? And in fact, you can even set that up as little mini experiments. How would you feel saying no to me right now? Oh boy, that feels uncomfortable. Let's give it a try. Would you take that pen off of that table and move it over there? No. Good job. Okay, let's do another breath practice. So this is typically a little bit more down-regulating, a little bit more relaxing. And this time you can bring your hands right below your diaphragm, or you can kind of frame your diaphragm with your hands. And this time we're breathing into the belly. And inhale. And exhale. And 2 more on your own. Sometimes you'll notice with clients that when they do this, the upper chest continues to want to take over and lift. You might need to do a little coaching to really let the breath settle down and let the diaphragm soften. Let the belly expand on the inhalation and deflate on the exhalation. Not that we're really breathing into the stomach. The air doesn't go there, right? But the emphasis is on softening the tension around the diaphragm and the tension in the muscles around the abdomen so that we can create what's much more of a relaxation response in the body. When you watch untraumatized infants breathe, their belly goes whoop, right? It's so beautiful, this little Buddha belly that moves with the breath. But we unlearn that. Many of us, whether or not we've been traumatized officially, right? But that we unlearn that because we live in a very sympathetically driven culture. And so we tend to do a lot of upper chest breathing, and it takes time to learn and sometimes even to teach clients how to do that. And, not every resource is right for every client. So I had one gal that came in and she had experienced a rape, and every time that we tried to do any conscious awareness of her breathing, she was going to have a panic attack. That was not safe. Her body was not a safe place to be. So that was not her resource, right? I was not going to push that. And so we're really taking feedback from the individual who we're working with on what works for them. And later in our work together, she said, that breathing thing, I think I'm ready to try that. Okay. But we had to establish more of a relationship, and she had to know that that she had some other resources in her situation. She needed her awareness to be outside of her body, not inside her body, to be resourced. Babette Rothschild, who has written several books on the keys to healing trauma, she's a body-centered psychotherapist, she talks about the interoceptive flooding that can happen from bringing awareness into the body. And for many individuals, we need to balance that out with exteroceptive awareness. Right? So it's always, while I think that somatic awareness and body awareness is great, and I have that bias, again, we're going to listen to the individual because that can be overwhelming for some people. So anything anyone wants to say here about either how you use breath or your thoughts around the breath practice here? These are very simple practices. You can get much more in depth about it. What you noticed. Pause here for a moment, please.
What did you mean when you said we live in a very sympathetically driven culture and how that affects the way we breathe?
Yeah. So the sympathetic nervous system, I guess, is just really highly praised in this culture. We're a go, 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 fast, driven. We're praised on speed. We're praised on productivity. All of that is really a reinforcing environment for the sympathetic nervous system. And the way that shows up in the body is that the sympathetic nervous system basically mobilizes us to go, right? And so it allows us to be productive and to get things done and to stay on task. And in a way, it ties over to your question about being on screens, which are also very high sympathetically stimulating, whether it's playing video games and there's a lot to track very quickly, or whether you're scrolling through social media. Again, either way, you're tracking a lot of information really quickly. And in the body, that sympathetic mobilization translates in a preparedness to go, which is often a very upper chest breathing style. So we, to exaggerate it there, we're going to get ready to run the race. They don't call it a rat race for no reason, right? And so practices, for example, like yoga nidra or yogic sleep or relaxation practices are a good balance for that sympathetically driven life that we get conditioned into. And we also need to be aware that for some clients who have more of a conditioned immobilization, that when we're bringing them into relaxation, they jump right back over into an immobilization trauma response. And so that window to really fine-tune a relaxed immobilization into safety has to be so sensitively relearned because sometimes clients are going into dissociation rather than relaxation. And a lot of that really is through dialogue, and it can happen in subtle ways, like every time I go to meditate, I fall asleep, right? Or I try and do that, that progressive relaxation thing, but I make it to my neck and then I'm gone. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes falling asleep can be reparative and nourishing, especially for individuals who have a hard time sleeping. But we also want to make sure that what's happening in there is not a repeat of a shutting down because that's all I know. That was all that I ever did, it was either on or off. There was no place in the middle. Does that make sense?